Snow hammered the mountainside so hard it sounded like stones thrown by a furious hand. Elias Blackwater shoved his shoulder against the cabin door, fighting the wind that clawed for a way inside. The latch finally caught, but the whole frame shuddered as if the storm meant to tear it from its hinges. His breath came sharp and white in the cold air, and he stood still a moment listening. The wind roared over the roof. The pines groaned. Something deep in the valley cracked like a rifle shot. Winter had come early, and it had come mean. He dragged the heavy bar across the door and wiped the wet snow from his beard. The fire behind him snapped, trying to keep its small claim on warmth. The room was dim, lit only by the stove's orange glow. A loaf of bread cooling on the table, a pot of stew thickening beside it. The quiet creak of the rafters, all of it felt too peaceful for a storm like this. Too peaceful for what he knew was waiting outside. A letter lay on the table, edges curled from the damp. He didn't have to open it again to remember the message. A new bride was on her way. Another woman sent through the broker, another promise that she was practical, steady, accustomed to hardship. He snorted bitterly. They said that about the last three. Each one had arrived with wide eyes and good intentions, only to crumble under isolation, cold, or disappointment. Nothing hardened a person like a mountain winter, and nothing frightened them more. Lightning flashed through the window, followed by a low rumble that rolled through the ground. Elias crossed the room and checked the north wall again, running his hand along the seam, where 2 logs had shifted in the spring thaw. It held for now. He had stuffed it with pitch and cloth months ago, but storms like this tested everything. He pressed his palm against it and closed his eyes. The wood felt cold, too cold. The storm wasn't done. His jaw tightened. The woman wouldn't make it through weather like this if she was anywhere near the pass. The wagon drivers stopped for nothing, and no one this time of year. If she was coming, she would come through hell to get here. A sudden pounding rattled the door. Elias spun, heart thudding. Wind couldn't knock like that. He crossed the cabin in 3 long strides, hand hovering near the rifle leaned against the wall. Another strike, louder this time, steadier. Not storm. Human. He dragged the bar free and heaved the door open just enough to see through the blowing white. Jonas Reed stood on the porch, coat crusted in snow, eyes narrowed from the sting of wind. "Storm caught you worse up here," Jonas shouted. "You got time to listen," Elias stepped aside. Jonas shouldered his way and stamping snow from his boots. "You heard about the supply run this morning?" Jonas asked, peeling off his gloves. Elias grunted. "Too late in the season for any wagon to be on the trail." "That's the problem," Jonas said. "They were on it anyway." Elias felt it in his gut. Before the man even spoke the words, the rider from Dolores said they sent her up. "The woman meant for you." Marisol Herrera. Jonas met his eyes. "She's out there in this." The storm howled against the cabin walls like an answer. Elias swallowed the heaviness rising in his throat. No one survived long on that trail once the wind buried the switchbacks. Not even seasoned mountain folk. He pictured a stranger wrapped in blankets clinging to the side of a wagon while the sky turned white. A woman who didn't know the land, didn't know the risks, didn't know him. "Why would they send her now?" Elias muttered. Jonas shrugged. "Deadlines and money. Folks in the city think snow is just snow until it's killing them." Elias turned toward the small window. Snow swirled like smoke, thick and blinding. He felt anger flare at the broker, at the storm, at the madness of timing, but beneath that burned something sharper. Guilt. He was the reason she'd been sent here. His request. His name on a contract. Jonas stepped closer to the fire. "I came to warn you not to ride out. No one with sense would leave this cabin tonight." Elias didn't answer. He was already thinking of the ridge path, the exposed sections where drifts hid the edge of the drop. Jonas cursed softly under his breath. I know that look. Don't be a damn fool. If she's out there, she might not be. Might have turned back. Might have stopped in Silver Basin. Or she might be freezing to death 10 paces off the trail. The wind slammed the door again, as though reminding them both what waited outside. Jonas's shoulders sagged. If you go out in this, you won't come back. Elias looked at the wall of white beyond the glass. Then I better hope she didn't come alone. Jonas's expression sobered. Elias, what do you think you're saving? You've had 7 women walk out on you. 7. Maybe it's time you stopped chasing the idea of a family in a place that swallows folks whole. Elias bristled. I'm not chasing anything. Then what are you doing? Elias didn't answer. He couldn't. He only knew the truth that lived quiet in his chest. He didn't want to die alone in these mountains, and he didn't want to live alone in them either. Jonas sighed. Come morning, if the storm eases, I'll help you check the pass. But you stay put till daylight. That's the only way any of this makes sense. Elias nodded, though his blood still throbbed with the urge to move. Jonas finished warming his hands, then pulled on his gloves again. Keep the fire strong, he said. This night's still got teeth. When Jonas stepped back out into the storm, the cold rushed in like a living thing. Elias secured the door once more and leaned his forehead against the wood. He listened to the wind batter the cabin and felt the helplessness of it settle in his bones. Somewhere out there, a woman he had never met was fighting the same storm, maybe losing. He walked to the table and sat heavily. The stew had cooled. The bread's crust had hardened. The room felt smaller than ever. He reached for the letter again. The ink had smeared from where moisture touched it earlier, but he could still read her name. Marisol Herrera. A name that sounded steady, strong. A name sent into a storm because of him. He folded the paper carefully and placed it beside the lantern. Outside, lightning flashed again, revealing nothing but swirling white. He stoked the fire until it blazed bright, but the warmth did nothing to ease the tension, tightening his chest. He could feel the mountain pressing in from every side, waiting, testing him as it always had. Toward midnight, the storm grew louder, angrier. The roof creaked. Snow thudded against the logs. Elias sat wide awake, listening for any sound out of place. A cry, a knock, a breaking branch. Anything. Nothing came but wind. When he finally rose to lay more wood on the fire, he glanced toward the window again. For just a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement through the snow, something dark, a shape shifting against the white. He froze, breath caught. But the wind howled and the shape vanished. Maybe imagination. Maybe hope. Maybe trouble. He sat back down restless, the storm flashing thin shadows across the walls. No one could survive long out there. No one should have been sent out in the first place. Still, he kept listening, and long before dawn, beneath the storm's fury, he heard something faint. Not the wind, not the trees, the slow, dragging groan of wagon wheels in deep snow. The woman stepped off the wagon like someone who already understood hardship, and Elias did not know whether to fear that or trust it. The storm had not eased so much as shifted its anger to the higher ridges, leaving the lower valley wrapped in a heavy, exhausted silence. Snow lay deep across the clearing in front of the cabin, bent the pine branches low, and muffled every sound except the creaking groan Elias had heard before sunrise. He had stood on the porch, rifle in hand, certain he'd imagined it. But then it came again. slow, burdened, wheels dragging through drifts that had no business letting a wagon pass. Now near midday, a dark outline emerged from the curtain of white. Two mules strained against their harnesses, their flanks packed with ice. The wagon lurched, skidded sideways, then righted itself with a shuddering jolt. The driver hunched forward beneath a soaked hat, his beard rimed with frost. And beside him, wrapped in a thick woolen shawl, sat a woman. Elias's heart seized before it had time to beat. She had come through the storm. Through that storm. No one should have survived that trail last night. Not with the wind cutting across the ridge the way it had. The wagon stopped 10 paces from the porch. The mules snorted clouds of steam trembling from strain. Elias stepped forward, boots sinking into the drift. The driver tipped his hat without climbing down. Elias Blackwater, he called, voice raspy from cold. Elias nodded. This here's Miss Marisol Herrera. She's yours, delivered from Santa Fe per arrangement. His tone carried no warmth, only exhaustion and something like disbelief. The woman beside him shifted, then placed her gloved hand on the edge of the wagon seat. Slowly, deliberately, she stepped down into the snow. Her boots sank deep, but she did not wobble. She braced herself with one hand on the wheel, lifted her chin, and met Elias's eyes. She was smaller than he expected, but solidly built, the kind of strength that came from work rather than weight. Her face was calm despite the cold, framed by dark strands of hair escaping her shawl. There was no fear in her expression. No trembling. Only a steady assessment, as though she were measuring the land, the cabin, and the man who stood before her. Senor Blackwater, she said, voice warm but firm. I am Marisol Herrera. I thank you for receiving me. Elias swallowed, unsure why words refused to come. He managed only a stiff nod. The driver wiped his nose with the back of his glove. Storm near killed us both on the pass, he muttered. Would have turned back if I could, but once the ridge iced over, only way out was through. He shot Elias a sharp look. Broker had no business sending a woman this late in the season. Elias agreed, but saying so wouldn't change anything. Marisol was here. Alive. And she was looking at him with an expression he didn't know how to read. Best get her inside before she freezes, the driver said, climbing back onto the wagon seat, with visible regret. Mules need rest, and I need distance from this mountain before nightfall. Don't expect me back until spring. Elias helped Marisol retrieve a single trunk from the back. It was heavier than it looked, yet she lifted one end without asking for help. Practical, uncomplaining. He carried it toward the cabin while she followed at a steady pace. Inside, the air was warm from the fire he had tended through the night. Marisol stepped across the threshold and paused, taking it all in: the stove, the long table, the stacked firewood, the rack of tools, the narrow bed in the corner. Her gaze lingered, not with judgment, but with quiet understanding. You built this yourself, she said. Mostly. He set her trunk down near the wall. It is strong, she said, touching the wooden table. A good home for a place like this. He felt a strange flicker of gratitude. Few had ever spoken of his work with respect. He cleared his throat. You must be cold. I can bring more wood to the stove. She shook her head. I am warm enough. The air inside is softer than anything I have felt since yesterday morning. She unwrapped her shawl and hung it on a peg, revealing a simple blue dress beneath worn but well cared for. He noticed her hands roughened from needlework and farm chores, the hands of someone who did not shy from labor. That alone eased something in him. The door creaked open again, letting in a burst of icy wind. Jonas Reed stepped inside, brushing snow from his coat. His eyes widened when he saw Marisol standing beside the fire. "Bless the saints," Jonas breathed. "You made it." Marisol turned politely. "We did. The mules deserve most of the credit." Jonas laughed, startled by her composure. Most women would be shaken after a storm like that. "Fear does not shorten a trail," she said simply. Jonas gave Elias a look that held more meaning than words. "This one is different." Elias wasn't ready to believe it, not yet, but something in his chest tightened all the same. "The ridge is clearing," Jonas said, voice turning serious. "But this storm was only the first. More'll come. She'll need time to settle before the real winter hits." Marisol nodded. "I understand the work ahead." Elias studied her again, not openly, but enough to see that she was telling the truth. She did understand. Or at least she intended to. Jonas stepped toward the door. "I'll head back before the drifts freeze solid. Elias, if you need anything, send a smoke signal downhill. I'll keep an eye out." Elias thanked him quietly. Jonas hesitated a moment, his gaze flicking between the two of them, as though committing something to memory. Then he left, and the wind swallowed the sound of his departure. The cabin fell into a silence that was not uncomfortable, only unfamiliar. Marisol moved toward the fire and held her hands near the heat. "I expected colder," she said. "The stove holds well," Elias replied. "Better now than it used to." "Storms test a home," she said, glancing toward the patched north wall. "Storms test people, too." He felt the weight of that truth settle between them. She turned fully toward him. "If I am to live here, I should learn the ways of this place. I do not arrive with fear. I arrive with purpose." He didn't know how to respond. No woman before had spoken this way. They had come with hope or desperation, but rarely conviction. "You'll have work," he finally said. "Plenty of it." "I expect so." She smiled, faint and calm. "Work makes a life. I have no fear of earning mine." Outside, the mules brayed as the driver prepared to descend the trail again. The wagon wheels groaned, echoing faintly through the trees. Elias listened until the sound faded. When he closed the door, only the mountain remained. Marisol bent beside her trunk and lifted the lid. He saw neatly folded clothes, a small tin of sewing needles, a bundle of herbs tied with twine, and a hand-carved wooden rosary. She handled each item with care, as though building a place for herself with every motion. The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. "Do you need anything?" Elias asked, unsure what was expected. "No," she said softly. "This cabin has enough for today. Tomorrow we will see what else it requires." Her calmness unsettled him, yet it steadied him too. She touched the table once more, the gesture quiet and thoughtful. "It is a good home," she said, "but a home reveals the heart of the one who built it." He felt heat rise beneath his collar. He wasn't used to being seen. Snow tapped lightly at the window, a gentler rhythm than before. The storm had left, but a sense of change hung in its wake, quiet and undeniable. Marisol straightened. "Tell me what I must learn first," she said. "The mountains demand respect. I do not intend to come to them ignorant." Her voice carried no hesitation. Elias nodded slowly, feeling the shift inside himself. Not hope, not yet, but something like its first breath. He glanced toward the window. Far beyond the tree line, the sky was darkening again. A hint of movement, a shadow crossing the ridge, signaled another visitor approaching the valley soon. This land rarely stayed quiet for long. "A house tells the truth about its maker," Marisol said. "This one speaks of loneliness and stubborn hope." The morning came pale and thin, the kind of light that barely pushed through the dawn after a storm. Elias woke before the sun rose over the ridge, habit pulling him from sleep. For a moment, he forgot there was someone else in the cabin, and the quiet felt familiar. Then he heard the soft rustle of fabric, the gentle clink of metal against wood, and memory returned like a slow breath. Marisol Herrera stood near the stove, wrapped in a shawl, examining the iron kettle with a careful eye. She had braided her dark hair loosely, and the firelight made the strands gleam like threads of copper. She did not look out of place. That more than anything unsettled him. "You rise early," she said without turning, her voice warm but steady. "So do storms," he replied, pulling on his boots. She glanced toward the shuttered window. "Then we are well matched." Her composure struck him again. No tremor in her voice. No lingering shock from the brutal journey. As if crossing a deadly pass in a blizzard were no more troubling than a long day's ride. She lifted the kettle with controlled strength and poured water into a cup. The scent of wild mint drifted up, faint but sharp, something she must have brought from her trunk. "I boiled snow," she said. "The water barrel was low." "That's good," Elias replied. "Barrel freezes this time of year." "I saw the ice." She sipped, eyes studying the room over the rim of the cup. "Your home is neat. Ordered. Structures like this do not happen by accident." He felt his jaw tighten, unsure what she meant. "A house tells the truth about its maker," she went on softly. "This one speaks of loneliness and stubborn hope." Heat prickled beneath Elias's collar. He didn't know how to answer something so direct. He busied himself with checking the traps he kept stored inside during winter, pretending to inspect buckles he already knew were sound. Marisol did not press him. She moved around the cabin with deliberate purpose, studying shelves, tools, the layout of the space. He watched her from the corner of his eye. There was no idle curiosity in her movements. She was learning the environment, understanding how the place functioned. That alone separated her from the 7 who'd left before. When she reached the north wall, she paused and touched the seam they'd patched during the storm. Her fingers traced the rough cloth stuffed between the logs. "This is where the wind forced its way in," she said. "It held," Elias replied, "because we worked together." He cleared his throat and looked away. The truth of it stirred something quiet inside him. She stepped back toward the stove. "Do you have chores that must be done today? I should learn what is expected." "Winter does not forgive inexperience." "There's plenty to do," Elias said. "Wood splitting, checking the roof for loose shingles, feeding the animals. We'll need to clear the snow near the shed, too. I can start with the woodpile," she offered. He hesitated. Not because he doubted her, but because he wasn't used to sharing work. Still, he nodded. "Tools are behind the cabin." She wrapped her shawl tight and stepped outside. The cold rushed in for a moment as the door opened, brushing his face with sharp air. Then the cabin fell silent again. Elias stood in the center of the room, unsure why he suddenly felt lighter and heavier at the same time. He never knew what to do with the presence of another person. Silence between two people felt different than silence alone, dense in a new way, full of intentions he couldn't read. He went to the window and watched her. She moved slowly through the snow, testing her footing, then reached the axe and lifted it with a practiced grip. Not elegant, but firm. She brought it down cleanly on the first log, splitting it straight through. Elias blinked. Most women who'd come before had barely managed to hold an axe, much less swing it. He watched her split several more logs, pausing only to adjust her gloves. The wind kicked up, carrying fine snow across the yard. Marisol didn't flinch. He found himself stepping outside without realizing it. The cold slapped him awake. The sky was a washed-out gray, but the storm had spent most of its rage. Snow muffled every sound except the thunk of the axe and the steady rhythm of her breath. "You swing well," he said, approaching. Marisol looked up. "My brothers taught me. Wood is wood, no matter the place." He took the axe from her and tested the blade. Still sharp. The edge had not dulled. "Need a heavier axe if you're splitting all winter. Then I will learn that weight too." Her certainty was disarming. No bravado, no complaint, just simple willingness. They worked side by side for a while, the air steaming faintly from their breath. She stacked the split logs with neat precision. The smell of fresh pine resin filled the clearing. After a while, she paused. "Why did the others leave?" He didn't answer at first. The memory of each departure came back sharp, and unwelcome doors, closing wagon wheels, fading, the tight ache of disappointment. "Most people want an easier life," he said finally. "A softer place. These mountains don't offer that." Marisol placed another split log on the pile. "I did not come seeking ease." "That's good," he said, "because ease isn't part of this land." When the woodpile was finally replenished, Marisol brushed snow from her dress and cheeks, her breath heavy but steady. Elias watched her walk toward the cabin, noting how she studied the slope behind the barn, the sky, the wind patterns. She wasn't a woman searching for escape. She was a woman taking measure. Inside, the warmth wrapped around them again. Marisol unwound her shawl and hung it neatly. Elias stowed the axe and gloves, feeling something shift in the air, a quiet recognition that she had not faltered on her first morning. "You work hard," he said. She offered a faint smile. "Life required it long before I came here." He believed her. She moved to her trunk, lifting another cloth bundle from it. As she arranged her few belongings on a shelf, she handled each item with a care that made the cabin feel different, not claimed exactly, but inhabited. Elias felt it too, the subtle shift of two people sharing the same space, creating a rhythm neither had yet spoken aloud. She turned toward him. "What task is next? We need to check the shed," he said. "Roof lost some shingles in the storm. I'll help." As they stepped outside again, Elias felt the weight of the sky, the way the clouds thinned toward the west, the faint line of movement near the tree line. A lone figure moved along the ridge, gliding with the deliberate steps of someone who knew the land intimately. Asha Skyhawk. Marisol followed his gaze. "A traveler, a friend," Elias said. "She knows these mountains better than anyone alive." Marisol nodded, curiosity flickering across her face. The figure drew closer, carrying a bundle wrapped in deerhide. Asha's dark braids swung in the wind. As she descended toward them, her expression sharp, perceptive, unreadable. Marisol straightened beside Elias, calm and ready to meet whomever the land sent their way. The snow crunched softly beneath Asha's boots as she approached, and the mountains seemed to quiet in acknowledgement. Elias felt the weight of change in the cold air, settling like a sign the season, and their lives were shifting once more. "Storms come in more than one shape," Asha said, her eyes flicking from the sky to Elias's guarded posture. Asha Skyhawk approached with the slow, balanced steps of someone who walked the mountains as easily as roads. Snow clung to the fringes of her deerskin leggings, and her braids swung like black cords against her shoulders. Marisol straightened instinctively beside Elias, her posture respectful but alert, as if unsure how to greet a woman who moved with such quiet command. Asha stopped a few paces away, her breath forming calm clouds in the cold air. She studied Elias first, the way one reads a familiar ridge to see whether winter has cracked it or left it whole. "You look tired," she said. "Storm kept me up," Elias replied, though he knew she was not speaking of the weather. Asha's gaze shifted to Marisol. And this is the woman sent to you. Marisol dipped her head politely. Marisol Herrera. Asha did not return the gesture at once. She watched Marisol with a long, steady look, the kind that searched for truth rather than appearances. Finally, she nodded. Your eyes know hardship. Hardship teaches well, Marisol said, unflinching. Asha smiled faintly, approval glinting like small embers. Good. The mountain respects those who have been tempered. Elias exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It mattered to him more than he cared to admit that Asha did not dismiss Marisol at first glance. Her opinion carried the weight of decades in these ridges. Asha unwrapped the deer-hide bundle she carried. Inside were dried herbs bound with twine strips of cured meat, a salve that smelled of pine resin, and a few pieces of spruce bark. For the storm that follows this one, she said, because there will be another. Marisol took the offerings carefully, her manner showing she understood the value of what she held. Thank you, she said. Your kindness is not small. Asha's eyes warmed. Kindness is not what keeps people alive here. Knowledge is. She pointed to the western horizon. Thick bands of clouds layered the sky low and heavy. The morning sun struggled to push through. Wind changed directions last night, Asha said. Winter is settling early. You'll have little time to teach her the ways of this land, Elias. Marisol turned to Elias' expression unreadable. I learn quickly. Asha chuckled. So I see. She stepped closer, touching one gloved finger to Marisol's sleeve. But learning the land is not the same as learning the man who lives on it. Elias stiffened at the accuracy of the comment. Marisol did not turn away. Then I will learn both. Asha's brows lifted. Brave words. Not brave, Marisol corrected gently. Necessary. The wind stirred between them, carrying the clean, sharp scent of snow yet to fall. Asha drew in a slow breath, tasting the air. The mountain is quiet today, she murmured. But it is a warning quiet, the kind before a shift. She faced Elias again. Storms come in more than one shape. Elias felt those words settle with unwelcome precision. He had survived winter's injuries and solitude, but letting another person into his life that was a different kind of storm. One he still wasn't sure he knew how to weather. Asha's eyes softened. Do not fear what changes you, she said. Fear what leaves you unmoved. Before Elias could respond, she turned and lifted her gaze toward the higher ridge. A hawk circled there, riding an updraft wings steady against the wind. Food will be scarce on the upper slopes this year, she said. The trap lines will thin sooner than you expect. Hunt lower. Teach Marisol the signs or she'll find herself lost in white before the snows deepen. I intend to, Elias said. Asha nodded, satisfied. She placed a hand briefly on Marisol's shoulder, a gesture of acceptance. You carry strength in your quiet, she told her. Use it. Marisol bowed her head slightly. I will try. Do more than try, Asha replied. The land listens. With that, she stepped back, repositioning her bundle. Her gaze shifted once more to Elias, searching for something in his face, resolve perhaps, or fear. Whatever she saw there made her straighten. This winter will ask more of you than the last, she said. It always does, Elias answered. But this time, she added, it will not ask it of you alone. Her words lingered long after she turned toward the trail. Elias watched her ascend the slope, with her graceful, tireless stride, leaving only faint prints behind her. Marisol stood quietly at his side. She held the herbs against her chest, her eyes on Asha's departing figure. She is wise, Marisol said. She is the mountains, Elias replied. knows them better than any map ever written. Marisol inhaled deeply, letting the cold air settle in her lungs. I understand why you respect her. Elias was struck by the sincerity in her tone. She hadn't spoken flattery. She had spoken truth. They walked back toward the cabin together. The air felt colder now despite the sun scraping its way over the ridge. Marisol placed Asha's herbs neatly on the table, handling them with reverence. These plants, she said softly, they are from someone who watches the land closely. It's how she stays alive, Elias replied. Marisol touched a stem of sage. Then I'll use them with care. Elias removed his gloves, his hands stiff from cold and emotion. Asha doesn't give to everyone, he said after a moment. Only to those she believes might last here. Marisol considered that her expression thoughtful. Then I am honored. He hadn't expected her to react that way. He found himself studying her again, the way she stood, the quiet steadiness in her breath, the calm way she absorbed her surroundings like a woman who had never needed to be told twice how the world worked. You said you wanted to learn this place, Elias murmured. If you're willing, we should start soon. I am willing, she said. Tell me where. He looked toward the northern tree line. Trap lines first. If the snow deepens too fast, I won't be able to run them alone. Marisol nodded, already reaching for her shawl. Practical. Focused. As if the day were no more complicated than gathering firewood. Before she stepped out into the snow again, she paused at the door. Asha said, storms come in more than one shape. What did she mean? Elias hesitated. The truth pressed against him, raw and unspoken. The storm in his chest had been building long before Marisol ever arrived. But he wasn't ready to reveal that. She meant the land, he said quietly, and everything it demands. Marisol studied him a moment longer, the way she had studied the logs, the tools, and the patched wall evenly, without fear. Then I will learn to face them, she said. She stepped outside and the cold swallowed her figure briefly before the daylight embraced her again. Elias followed, clasping his coat shut. The sky was shifting, thin streaks of silver stretching across the horizon, a sign that the weather was far from finished with them. Far beyond the cabin, the forest waited in tall, dark silence, thick with unbroken snow. He motioned toward the trees. Marisol nodded, falling into step beside him, her breath steady as she followed him into the path carved between the pines. The land ahead was quiet, but it was the kind of quiet that carried a warning underneath a promise that the mountains were watching everything, weighing everything, ready to test what they had only begun to build. If that wall gives the cold, we'll take us, Elias muttered, and for the first time Marisol heard fear in his voice. Snow came again, before dusk light, at first drifting soft as ash, then tightening into sharp needles that slashed sideways across the slope. Elias felt the shift in the air, long before the sky darkened. The temperature dipped hard, the kind of drop that made the lungs sting with each breath. He had hoped for one more calm night before the next storm, but the mountains did not wait for anyone's convenience. Marisol walked beside him as they returned from the trap line. Their boots sank deep, each step a struggle against the thickening drifts. She carried the small bundle of snares they'd reset. Elias carried the fox they'd caught, a thin one barely worth the trouble, proving Asha's warning had been right. By the time they reached the clearing, the wind had grown fierce, pushing them backward. The cabin's outline blurred behind the swirling white, its lantern glow fighting to pierce the storm. Elias quickened his pace. Inside, warmth met them like a living thing. Marisol shut the door, leaning her back against it, while she caught her breath. Snowflakes clung to her braids and lashes. Her cheeks glowed with cold and exertion. She didn't speak for a long moment, simply inhaled deeply, letting the heat thaw her skin. Elias shook off the snow and hung their coats near the stove. Storm came faster than it should have. She nodded. The air tasted different. He turned surprised. How so sharp? Metallic, like cold iron. She rubbed her hands together, warming them. In New Mexico, when the air changed like that, hail followed. Here, snow takes its place. Her observations settled between them, quiet and sure, but the storm did not give them time for calm. A low groaning sound reverberated through the cabin walls. Elias's head snapped up. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and pressed his hand against the north wall. A thin draft licked across his palm. Marisol's brow furrowed. The storm found the seam again. No. Elias muttered, eyes narrowing. It widened. The wind slammed into the cabin as if to punctuate his words. The logs shuddered. Snowflakes seeped through the small gap they had patched days before, carried by the relentless force of the storm. Marisol stepped closer. Is it dangerous if that wall gives? Elias said, jaw tight. The cold will take us. It was the first time she had heard fear in his voice, not the brittle fear of a man unprepared, but the deep, steady fear of someone who understood exactly how close winter could press to death. She did not panic. She moved to the trunk, retrieving the bundle of cloth she had used before. Tell me what to do, she said. He stared at her for half a heartbeat, caught off guard by the resolve in her tone. Then he grabbed a lantern and lifted it toward the gap. The flame wavered wildly. We need to pack the seam before the wind widens it, he said. Push cloth deep as it'll go, keep the draft from slicing through. She knelt beside him, fingers already working. The gap was thinner than a finger width, but relentless in what it allowed through. Snowflakes spiraled in, melting instantly on Marisol's hands. Harder, Elias said, voice tight. The storm's pushing more. She pressed the fabric deeper. Her fingers moved quickly, deftly reaching into the narrow places his could not. Elias felt a jolt of gratitude, an unfamiliar feeling almost painful in its intensity, because she was not flinching, not faltering, not asking for rest. Another gust slammed the cabin, and the wall groaned in protest. Marisol steadied herself and kept working. Minutes stretched taut as wire. The lantern hissed each time the wind squeezed through the seam. Elias held the log with one hand, bracing it as if his weight alone could keep the wall from shifting further. Finally, the draft slowed. The wind still battered the cabin, but the cold no longer sliced through the gap. Marisol pulled her hands back, breath heavy but even. It's holding. For now, Elias said quietly. He stood, touched the patched seam again, then moved his hand to Marisol's wrist. It was cold, too cold. He guided her toward the stove. You should warm your hands, he said. She lingered only long enough for the heat to settle into her skin. Then she turned back to him. What else must be done? Elias almost smiled. Not fully, not enough to change his face. But something in him loosened. Her determination steadied him more than he expected. The wind roared and the walls trembled again. Snow thudded against the roof with the weight of a falling branch. Storm might last days, he said. We need to check the roof brace, the stovepipe, and the back shutter. If the shutter blows open, the draft'll choke the fire. She nodded. Tell me where it is. They worked through the cabin like two people who had been sharing responsibilities for years instead of days. Marisol checked the shutter, sealing it with an extra length of rope. Elias climbed the loft ladder and inspected the roof brace from below. He shouted down instructions, and Marisol secured the lower beams with knots she tied quickly and cleanly. The storm pounded harder. Snow piled high against the windows, turning the world outside into a shifting wall of white. The fire crackled loud, as if fighting for its own survival. Hours passed. They moved together in a rhythm that neither spoke aloud. Elias reinforced the stovepipe. Marisol kept the fire fed. Elias checked the door. Marisol mixed a salve from Asha's herbs in case frostbite threatened either of them before the night ended. The storm screamed. The cabin held. When they finally paused breathless, the only sound inside was the fire. Elias leaned against the table, shoulders tight with exhaustion. Marisol knelt by the stove, her hair damp with melted snow. She looked up at him. "Is this always how winter comes here?" "Sometimes it's worse," he said. "Sometimes better. But it never comes gentle." She nodded once. The land wants to see who can stand beside it. He didn't know if the land cared about anything so human, but the way she said it made sense. Made sense in a way the mountains often did, only to those who listened closely. A sharp crack echoed outside somewhere near the shed. Elias stiffened. "That sounded like wood splitting," Marisol whispered. "Big drift pressing against the shed wall," Elias said. "Storms pushing the whole slope. Is it dangerous?" "Not if it doesn't shift again." She moved closer to him, her expression calm but alert. "Then we stay ready." He met her gaze. In the firelight, her eyes reflected something steady and grounded. Not hope, not naive courage, but resolve, the same quality in the mountains themselves, the thing that allowed them to stand under centuries of storms. Wind slammed the cabin once more. Snow pressed higher against the shutters. Marisol returned to the fire, adding more wood. The flames danced upward, filling the cabin with a fierce, defiant glow. Elias watched her for a long moment, her hands sure, her back straight, her movements deliberate. She had not broken. Not during the storm on the ridge. Not during the wall repair. Not now. The realization settled deep inside him, quiet and undeniable. "What else needs tending?" she asked. He looked at the north wall again. The patched seam held firm, but tomorrow they would need to reinforce it before the storms returned. The thought of facing the next one with her beside him felt strangely bearable, almost welcome. "The roof," he said. "When the storm eases, we'll check it for damage." Marisol nodded. "We will." The fire crackled steady and bright. Outside, the storm began to change its voice. The wind didn't quiet, it shifted pitch the way it did when exhaustion set in. Marisol straightened, listening. "It's losing strength." "For now," Elias murmured. But he knew the mountains well enough to recognize a lull when he heard one. And as the wind softened to a ragged whisper, a different kind of silence pressed against the cabin, one that signaled the storm would break soon, revealing what the land had become under its weight. The moment it did, the world outside would demand to be faced again. "It's beautiful," Marisol whispered at the sparkling valley, and Elias realized she was seeing what he'd forgotten to look at. The storm broke just before dawn. The wind tapered into a tired sigh, and the heavy pounding against the cabin walls softened into a gentle ticking of melting frost. Elias had slept only in short bursts, rising each time the roof creaked or the fire dimmed. When the last gust finally faded, he sat awake on the edge of the bed, listening to the hush that followed the storm's fury. Marisol stirred near the stove. She had insisted on keeping the fire alive while he rested, though he'd argued she needed sleep. She rose now, shawl wrapped tight, and moved to the window. Her breath fogged the cold glass. "It stopped," she murmured. Elias pulled on his coat boots, still stiff from yesterday's wet snow. We'll see the damage soon enough. But when he opened the cabin door, the sight waiting outside made him stop short. The world lay buried under a vast, blinding white. Snow rose almost to the lower window ledge, draped thickly over branches and fence rails. The valley stretched in every direction, glittering under the first light of morning. Sunlight caught the ice crusts, sending sharp shards of color skimming across the drifts, blues, pinks, golds, shifting slowly as the sun climbed higher. Marisol stepped up beside him. Her breath caught. "My God," she whispered. "It's beautiful." He looked at the land, then at her. Snow dusted her hair, and the light softened her expression into something open and unguarded. He'd spent years looking at this valley, and had forgotten what it could be, how it could stun, how it could quiet a person, even after a night spent fighting it. Her wonder made the mountains new again. Elias cleared his throat. "Beautiful doesn't mean safe. We still need to check the—" He stopped as she smiled faintly. "I know. But let me see it for a moment more." He let her. She stepped onto the porch, her boots disappearing into untouched snow. She lifted her hand to feel the cold sunlight, as if measuring the day's promise. A silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but full. After that brief stillness, Elias shook off the spell and headed toward the shed. "Roof first," he called behind him. Marisol followed, stepping into his trail prints, where the snow was already compacted. The shed leaned under the weight of the storm, the back wall bowed inward but not broken. He pressed his palm against the boards. Still holding, he muttered, "We'll need to brace it tomorrow." Marisol ran her hand along the roofline. It survived a fierce night. Barely. She didn't argue, but her tone held something gentle. Barely is enough for today. They turned next to the animal shelter. Snow blocked the small pen entrance, but the hens inside were alive, though indignant, clucking loudly. Marisol crouched to check them, while Elias shoveled a path with wide strokes. "You fuss too much," he said, though his voice softened. "Life is life," she answered. "Even a small one." He couldn't argue with that either. By mid-morning they stood together on the rise behind the cabin, surveying the valley again. Sunlight had melted the top layer of snow, sending thin rivulets along the slope. A breeze stirred the frost-heavy branches overhead. For a moment, the mountains seemed peaceful, forgiving. But Elias felt the need to look beyond the beauty, beyond the calm. Winter storms rarely came alone. Asha had warned as much. "We still need to check the trap line on the ridge," he said. "Storm might have buried it completely." Marisol nodded. "I'll pack supplies." Her willingness, so immediate and steady, still unsettled him in ways he couldn't quite explain. Most women had trembled their first morning on the mountain. Some had cried. One had begged the driver to return the moment she saw the cabin. But Marisol accepted the land's demands, without dramatics, without bravado. Only purpose. She returned with a small satchel, a flask, and a cloth-wrapped bundle of Asha's herbs. Elias checked her boots, gloves, and coat without thinking. She didn't admonish him for it. They started up the ridge path. The storm had carved deep troughs into the snow, and the incline made each step a strain. Elias cut the trail, breaking the crust with careful pressure. Marisol stayed close behind, adjusting her stride to match his. When he paused for breath, she handed him the flask without being asked. He drank, then returned it to her. Her breath condensed in slow clouds as she watched the valley's light shift between the trees. "You walk steady for someone who's never seen snow like this," he said. "I learned balance on steep ground in New Mexico," she replied. "Dust instead of snow, but land is land. Her practical way of speaking kept surprising him. She didn't soften her words to please him. She didn't over-explain. She simply spoke truth. When they reached the first trap site, Elias knelt and cleared the snow with his hands. Empty, half buried. He reset it quickly. Animals were moving before the storm, he said. Now they'll hide deeper. Will that be a problem? Marisol asked. It can be, he admitted, if the lines don't fill. But we'll manage. They continued upward. On the second trap, they found fresh tracks, thin, deliberate weaving between the trees. Marisol crouched, studying them. Rabbit, she said. Young one. Elias blinked. You know tracks, I know survival, she answered. They followed the ridge line until midday, then paused near a rocky outcrop where the wind finally broke enough to rest. Marisol leaned against a boulder, her breath warming the scarf around her mouth. It looks different out here, she said softly, gazing over the valley. How quieter, she murmured, as if everything is listening. Elias had always felt that too. The mountains were never silent. They were attentive, watching, listening for what he asked. Who can endure them, she said simply. They finished the trap line just as the light began to weaken. The sun dipped behind a distant ridge, casting long purple shadows across the snow. Elias motioned for them to descend before the cold returned with night. The wind picked up halfway down the mountain, not fierce, just enough to whisper change. Marisol tightened her shawl, but her pace remained steady. When they finally reached the cabin clearing, Elias exhaled a long, warm breath of relief. Inside, the fire was quick to build. Marisol hung her coat near the stove and began preparing a simple meal, cornmeal cakes and dried meat softened in broth. Elias worked on mending the trap they'd found bent under a fallen branch. The warmth, the scent of food, the quiet movements, it felt natural, like a life forming its own shape. As they ate, Marisol looked toward the window. Snow reflected the fire's light, glowing faintly in the dusk. Do the storms always come so close together? She asked. Most winters. Elias took a slow bite. But this year feels heavier. Asha said the same. She sees things before the rest of us. Marisol nodded thoughtfully, stirring the bowl in front of her. Then we prepare, yes, before the land shifts again. Elias watched her. The calm determination in her voice was something he could rely on more than he'd expected, more than he'd allowed himself to hope. He set his bowl aside. Tomorrow I'll start teaching you more. Tracks, wind signs, rifle work. She met his eyes without hesitation. Good. I want to know everything I need to survive here. The directness of her words settled into his chest, warm and steady. Outside, the wind nudged the shutters, lightly testing them, not with the force of the previous storm, but as a reminder that winter had only begun. Marisol rose to add more wood to the fire. As the flames brightened, shadows danced across the walls like moving branches. Elias leaned back in his chair, breathing in the warmth, the scent of pine and something new, something like ease. He hadn't felt that in years. Marisol glanced toward him, her expression thoughtful. We have much to learn together, she said quietly. Elias nodded. And the mountains won't wait long to test us. The fire crackled steady and alive, its glow reflecting off the snow outside as the night settled deep around them. If we are to survive together, Marisol said, then teach me the land that shaped you. Morning light seeped slowly across the mountains, pale as milk and just as quiet. The cold had settled deep overnight, tightening the air until every breath felt sharp. Elias stepped outside first, testing the snow's crust with his boot. The top layer had frozen firm, glinting like glass under the rising sun. It would make travel easier, at least for the early hours. Marisol emerged behind him, shawl-wrapped, close rifle slung across her back, just as he'd taught her. She moved with a steadiness that had become familiar to him in a way he never expected. No hesitation, no uncertain glances toward the distance as so many before her had done. She stood in the doorway a moment, taking in the morning as though reading it. "What do you see?" Elias asked. She inhaled slowly. "The sky is too clear. That means the cold will stay hard." He nodded. "Good. What else, too?" "The snow is settled enough for travel," she said, "but the slope near the creek will be dangerous by afternoon. Sun warms it first." Elias studied her, not the words, but the precision in her tone. She wasn't guessing. She was learning the land with deliberate focus, and he felt a pull in his chest at the sight. "We start on the West Trail today," he said. "Covers higher ground, but gives a good look at the ridge. Animals move different up there." She met his gaze, calm and ready. "If we are to survive together, then teach me the land that shaped you." He didn't respond right away. The words struck deeper than she likely intended, settling into the part of him that had gone quiet after too many winters alone. Finally, he nodded and stepped aside so she could join him. They moved out in a steady line, Elias cutting the path, Marisol close behind. Their breaths rose into the cold air like twin plumes. Pine branches sagged under the frost, and the world held a hush so complete it felt sacred. Elias led her to a small clearing where snow lay untouched. "Tracks," he said, pointing to a faint disturbance near a cluster of bushes. Marisol crouched, running her glove lightly over the indentation. "Deer," she said. "Young." "How can you tell the prints are narrow?" Hesitant. "A grown deer steps with more weight and confidence." He let out a quiet chuckle. "You're learning faster than I did." "My brothers hunted," she said with a shrug. "I learned by watching." She followed the tracks a short distance, her steps careful and her eyes alert, and Elias found himself watching her more than the trail. She carried herself like someone who respected the land rather than feared it, and that alone made her different from anyone he'd ever known. They walked until they reached the ridge overlook, a frozen sweep of land dropping into a valley thick with black spruce. Wind brushed against them gently, carrying the smell of pine resin and distant snow. Elias pointed toward a faint shadow shifting among the trees. "Elk herd," he said. "They're moving early this year." Marisol squinted. "Because the storms pushed them lower." "That's part of it." She nodded, absorbing the information. They continued along the ridge. Elias taught her how to read wind direction by the movement of loose snow. He explained which trees broke first under storm weight, how ice formed differently on exposed rock, and how to listen for the subtle warning hum of shifting drifts. Marisol repeated each detail softly, committing it to memory. When they reached a fallen pine thick with ice, she rested her hand on the exposed trunk. "The land has a language," she said quietly. "You just have to stop talking long enough to hear it." Elias found himself pausing, struck by the simple truth in her voice. He had spent years listening to this mountain, until its rhythms felt like an extension of himself. But hearing her articulate it so plainly stirred something inside him, a recognition of a shared understanding he had never expected. "I always thought the same," he admitted, "but I've never heard anyone else say it." She offered a faint smile. "Then we understand it together." They worked their way deeper into the ridge forest. Elias stopped suddenly and raised a hand. Marisol halted instantly behind him. A soft crunch sounded to the west. "Not wind." not settling ice. Fox, Elias whispered. Small one. Could be near the bait trap. He motioned for her to follow quietly. They moved between the trees with cautious steps. When they reached the clearing, they saw fresh tracks weaving around the trap site. Marisol crouched. It came close, she observed, but didn't commit. Smart animal, Elias said. Trap might be too exposed. She adjusted one of the branches he'd placed as cover using the snow to hide the steel better. Better now. The fox will return. He watched the way her hands moved, careful but decisive. She wasn't mimicking his actions. She was thinking for herself, adapting. He admired that more than he knew how to say. They descended toward the creek at midday. The water moved beneath a thin layer of ice, whispering in small currents. Marisol knelt at the bank, touching the surface lightly. It sounds different today, she said. It's freezing faster, Elias replied. Means colder nights ahead. When she rose, she slipped slightly on the icy bank. Elias steadied her quickly, his hands firm around her arms. You all right? He asked. Yes, she said, breath forming a pale cloud between them. Thank you. He released her slowly. Creek's always tricky this time of year. I'll remember. They returned to the trail. The sun dipped lower, turning the snow golden. Shadows stretched long across the slope. Elias walked with an awareness he hadn't felt in years, the awareness of another heartbeat pacing beside his someone depending on his knowledge, yet contributing her own in ways he hadn't predicted. As they neared the cabin, Marisol looked toward the sky. Clouds are thin, she said. Another cold night. You're right, Elias said. Could be a hard freeze. We'll bring in more wood. They reached the cabin as dusk settled. Elias set down the day's catches, only a couple of rabbits, not much, but enough, and Marisol lit the lantern inside. The warm glow filled the room, chasing away the cold, creeping along the edges. She hung her shawl near the fire. Thank you for teaching me today. You learned fast, Elias said. Faster than I expected. I had a good teacher. She paused, her voice softening. And a land willing to be known. He tilted his head. Most people don't think that way. Most people don't listen long enough, she said. Her words held weight he couldn't ignore. He felt something shift between them, unspoken but real, like the beginnings of a bridge being built, plank by plank. They shared a quiet meal. Marisol prepared stew from the rabbit meat, adding a pinch of Asha's herbs. The aroma filled the cabin, warm and earthy, and Elias felt a comfort he hadn't known in years. As the firelight flickered, Marisol sat beside it with her hands folded in her lap. Tell me what I must learn next, she said. Elias glanced toward the rifle leaning near the door. Tomorrow we work on shooting. Weather signs too. Storms don't always give warning. I'm ready, she said. The wind brushed gently against the shutter outside, not harsh, not threatening, but present. A reminder that the mountains were always watching, always waiting. Marisol's eyes followed the sound. Winter will test us again. It will, Elias said, and we'll be ready. The fire crackled between them, its glow steady and warm, casting long shadows on the walls as the night wrapped around the cabin and the mountains settled into another breath of cold and quiet. We live as partners in work, she said. But is that all you intended us to be? The morning after their long day on the ridge came clear and sharp, the kind of cold that cut deep but carried no malice. Elias rose before first light to stoke the fire, careful not to wake Marisol. She had worked hard the previous day, absorbing every lesson, as if she'd been born to the mountain. He watched her now as she slept in the faint firelight, her breathing soft, steady. Her presence filled the cabin in a way he still struggled to understand. Not crowding, not unsettling, simply there. He stepped outside with the rifle in hand. The snow was firm underfoot, gleaming faintly in the darkness. The sky held the kind of stillness that usually meant a day without storms, though not without challenges. He tested the air, tasted the cold, and found no immediate threat. When he returned inside, Marisol was awake, tying her hair back with a strip of cloth. She looked up at him calmly. "The fire was warm when I rose," she said. "I kept it going," Elias replied, setting the rifle aside. "You needed the rest." She gave a small nod as if accepting the gesture for exactly what it was, and nothing more. She rose, walked to the stove, and began preparing a simple breakfast. The scent of warm cornmeal filled the cabin. Elias sat at the table watching quietly as she moved with practiced ease. When she served the bowls and sat across from him, there was something different in her posture, something still but not passive. She rested her hands on the table, fingers intertwined. "You teach me the land," she said softly. "You show me its dangers, its signs, its rhythms. I said I would." Elias answered. "And I am grateful," she added. "But I must ask you something." He felt a faint tension coil in his chest. "Go on." She studied him, her dark eyes unwavering. "We live as partners in work," she said. "But is that all you intended us to be?" The question landed between them with the weight of a tree falling in deep snow, quiet, but impossible to ignore. Elias inhaled slowly. He hadn't expected the conversation to arrive so plainly so soon, yet he knew it had been building like a storm forming behind the calm. He paused, searching for words that had rusted from years of disuse. "I didn't expect you to stay," he admitted. "Not at first." Marisol did not look offended, only patient. "But I have stayed." "Yes," he said. "You have." And now she asked, "What do you hope for?" He stared down at his hands, rough scarred, shaped by wood and rope and cold. "Hope," he murmured. "Feels like a dangerous thing to use words like that." "Hope is always dangerous," she said. "But so is silence." Her tone was gentle, not demanding. She wasn't pressing him to make promises he couldn't keep. She was asking him to see truth, to speak it if he could. Elias lifted his gaze back to hers. "I want more than work," he said finally. "More than just sharing chores and chores alone. But wanting doesn't mean expecting. I've learned not to expect what I can't earn." Marisol held his gaze steady as a stone set in riverbed. "And what do you believe you must earn?" Elias exhaled slowly. "Trust," he said. "Companionship. A life built together not side by side because of necessity, but because of choice." Her expression softened, but not with pity, with recognition. She reached across the table and touched the edge of his hand, not holding, simply resting there, testing the distance between them the way one tests thin ice on a lake. "I came here for truth," she said. "Not fantasy, not escape. A real partnership. And real partnership requires understanding each other, not just knowing the land." Elias swallowed against a knot forming in his throat. He wasn't used to someone speaking to him this way, with clarity, with intention. "You're not afraid of saying what you want," he murmured. "I've learned that unspoken things become heavy things," Marisol said. "I would rather we speak clearly, even if the truth is difficult." He nodded slowly, appreciating the solidness of her words. No games. No softness meant to placate him. Just honest ground to stand on. "We're still learning each other," he said. But I want more than just surviving under the same roof. Marisol withdrew her hand not abruptly, but with a gentle finality that said she had heard enough for now. Not because the conversation was finished, but because something had been settled. That is what I needed to know, she said quietly. Their bowls had gone cold. The room felt strangely full, though neither of them moved. Outside, the faint morning light brightened, casting the outlines of frost against the window. Elias cleared his throat. We should get started. Weather's good for shooting lessons. Marisol rose, tying her shawl tightly. I'm ready. He watched her gather the rifle, noting how naturally she held it now. They stepped outside, the cold, crisp, and biting their cheeks. The valley lay wide and white, stretched under a pale sky. Elias led her to a small clearing where the snow had settled between fir trees. He set a tin can on a stump and stepped back. Show me your stance, he said. She positioned her feet, holding the rifle close but not too tight. He adjusted her shoulders, nudged her elbow gently. Breath controls the shot, he murmured. She inhaled slowly, exhaled even slower, then squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the cold air, echoing against the distant ridge. She missed by an inch. Again, Elias said, unable to hide a flicker of pride. She reloaded and fired. Missed only by a thumb width. Again. Third shot struck the can, cleanly sending it spinning into the snow. Marisol lowered the rifle, expression composed but clearly pleased. You're learning fast, Elias said. I told you I'm determined, she replied. He nodded. Determination keeps people alive here. And partnership, she asked. He met her gaze, the cold air burning his lungs as he spoke. That too. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then looked toward the ridge. Her breath formed a gentle plume. We should check the line near the birches before the sun melts the crust, she said. Elias agreed, though he couldn't shake the weight of their earlier conversation. It lingered like warmth in the cold, a persistent presence, something he could no longer dismiss. They walked together through the trees, the snow crunching beneath their boots. The birch branches glimmered thin frost clinging to their bark like silver lace. As they followed the tracks of a rabbit weaving through the bushes, Marisol asked, Do storms always reveal more than the damage they leave? Sometimes, Elias said. Sometimes they show the weak parts. And sometimes, she said, they show what can hold. He didn't answer, but he felt the truth of it settle deep inside him. When they reached the birch grove, Elias crouched to reset a sprung trap. Marisol scanned the ground for signs of movement. A fresh set of tracks larger than rabbit cut across the snow. Coyote, she said. Close to, Elias added, probably hungry. The knowledge tightened something in both of them, a reminder that the land's tests were never finished. As they retraced their steps toward the cabin, Marisol walked close to Elias, her presence quiet but confident. Not clinging, not distant, simply there, matching his pace. A cold wind rose across the ridge, carrying a deep, hollow sound from the valley. Elias paused, listening. Marisol looked to him. Is something wrong? No, he said, though he wasn't completely sure. Just the mountains shifting after the storm. They reached the cabin as the sun dipped behind the ridge. Marisol placed the rifle near the door and began preparing supper. Elias sat by the fire, watching her move through the room with familiarity now, as if the space had accepted her presence. As the stew simmered, she looked toward him once more. There is still more to understand between us, she said quietly. There is, Elias agreed. And we will. He nodded. Outside, the wind moved through the trees in a long, low sweep, bending the branches gently, almost like an exhale, almost like a signal. that the land was settling for now, but not for long. A home grows like a tree, Marisol said, placing her hand on a fresh beam. One ring at a time. The thaw came slowly, not as a sudden release, but as a gradual softening of the land. Snow no longer cracked sharply beneath their boots. Instead, it sagged and gave way, surrendering to the warmer days. Thin streams of meltwater wound down the slope like silver threads gathering at the base of the valley, where the earth drank deeply. Elias felt the change inside himself as much as he felt it in the soil. Something had shifted during the winter between them, within him, in the walls of the cabin, that had once echoed only his footsteps. The air seemed easier now, fuller threaded with the quiet rhythm of two people working side by side. On one of the first truly warm mornings, Marisol stood beside the cabin studying the foundation, as if reading a map carved into the earth. "This home could use another room," she said. Elias paused halfway through splitting a log. Another room, she walked along the outer wall, fingertips brushing the wood. "For sewing. For your woodworking. For storage. And, perhaps later, something else." What something else, he asked, uncertain. Her gaze moved toward the valley, soft but steady. "Space for a future." The words rooted in him before he had time to react. He set down the axe. "You think the cabin needs it?" he said, though he already knew she meant more. "I think we need it," she corrected gently. "A home grows like a tree, one ring at a time." He let the meaning settle between them. The idea warmed him in a way he wasn't prepared for. He looked at the cabin, at its simple shape, at the roofline patched again and again over the years. He had built it to survive. She was asking him to build something to live in. "We could do it," he said. "Add a room on the south side. The sun hits there longest." A faint smile curved her lips. "Then let's begin." They spent the morning hauling old lumber from the shed, measuring space, marking lines in the dirt with a stick. Marisol held the measuring rope while Elias cut beams, her fingers steady even when the saw rasped loudly. She had an instinct for practical work, as though every task she touched found its way into order. By midday, sweat glistened at Elias's temples, despite the cool breeze. Marisol's hair stuck to her cheek, where the wind had blown it loose from her braid. "You all right?" he asked. She nodded. "Work feels good after so much winter." He felt the same movement after long stillness, creation, after weeks of survival. As they worked, the sound of hooves echoed from the lower trail. Elias looked up. Jonas Reed rode into view, leading a mule loaded with supplies. He lifted a hand in greeting. "Well, now," Jonas called, reining in near the cabin. "Looks like you two are planning something big." Marisol smoothed her skirt and stepped forward. "We're adding a room." Jonas grinned broadly. "A room, Elias. You finally giving yourself space to breathe." Elias grunted, though a faint smile tugged at him. "Just improving what needs improving." "Mm-hmm." Jonas drawled, his gaze flicking knowingly between the two of them. "Funny how homes start improving once there's more than one heartbeat in them." Marisol didn't blush or look away. She simply turned to Elias, her expression calm. "We'll need your help lifting the heavy beams." Jonas laughed and swung off his horse. "At your service." They carried the logs together, Jonas at one end, Elias at the other, Marisol steadying and guiding. Jonas never commented on her strength or her involvement. He accepted it as he accepted mountain weather, something to work around, but never underestimate. When they set the final beam in place for the day, Jonas brushed his hands off and leaned against a post. "Looks like you're building something real here," he said. Marisol nodded. "We are." Jonas smiled, though there was something gentle in it. Good. Elias deserves someone who understands the land and the silence. Elias shot him a look, but Jonas only winked and stepped away to check his mule's footing. Later, after Jonas had left and the sun dipped low, Elias and Marisol stood before the beginning of the new room, a frame of beams and promise. You planned this, Elias said, realizing it as he spoke. You saw this long before I did. Marisol looked at the skeletal frame, her voice soft but certain. I saw possibility, and I wanted to build it with you. The simplicity of her words struck him deeper than any winter wind. He had spent years believing nothing lasting could be built beside him. Yet here she stood steady as the mountains offering a future, measured not in fear, but in effort. He stepped closer. Marisol, I want this too. She met his gaze without hesitation. Then let us finish it together. That evening they ate outside on the porch, watching the sky turn gold, then rose, then deep blue. The mountains, usually harsh with their silence, seemed almost tender with dusk settling over them. Marisol leaned her arms on the railing, watching the first stars flicker. Elias, she said softly, do you ever regret living here? He shook his head. Never the land. Only the loneliness. And now he considered her for a long moment. Now the silence feels different. Marisol's breath caught, barely noticeable, but enough. When they finished eating, Elias went inside to fetch a small wooden box he kept hidden beneath his bed. He had carved it years ago, but never had a reason to use it. Inside lay small nails, a piece of twine, a folded scrap of paper items meant for a home he'd once hoped to build with someone else, though that hope had always faded too quickly. He set the box on the new beam. Tomorrow, he said, we'll raise the south wall. Marisol touched the box lightly. And someday, perhaps more. Her meaning flickered in the air, warm and steady. Elias didn't shy away. If that's the future you want. It is, she said. The weight of her confession wasn't heavy. It was grounding. It settled into him like a truth he had been circling for months. A breeze brushed through the pine trees, cool and gentle. Elias glanced toward the ridge. A familiar figure moved along the crest, Asha Skyhawk's silhouette, unmistakable in the fading light. She paused, watching the two of them and the beginnings of their work. Marisol noticed her too. She sees the room we're building. And she'll know what it means, Elias said. Marisol smiled faintly. Then let her see. Asha lifted a hand in greeting, before turning to follow the trail, her form blending into the twilight. Something in the gesture felt like a blessing. As the last light faded, Elias and Marisol lingered beside the unfinished frame. She rested her palm against one of the beams, her touch light, but full of intention. A home grows like a tree, she murmured. One ring at a time. Elias placed his hand beside hers, the two palms touching the wood side by side. The gesture felt like a promise, not spoken, not demanded, but rooted deeply in the shared work they had begun. Behind them, the cabin glowed warmly, its single window shining. Against the gathering dark, one ring of life already formed, another just beginning. The preacher watched them pass tools back and forth and murmured, some folks marry for love, some marry for survival. You two built something sturdier than both. Summer rose slow and golden across the mountains, the kind that ripened the air with resin and warmed the earth without stealing its sharpness. The snow on the high ridge lingered only in thin streaks, stubborn patches of white that clung to shadowed crevices. But below where the cabin stood, the world had softened. Wildflowers unfurled near the creek. Pine needles filled the wind with a sweet, clean scent. Life stretched its limbs after winter's long hold. The new room was nearly finished. Elias sanded the final beam while Marisol swept wood shavings into tidy piles. Light spilled through the wide southern window frame, illuminating the smooth grain of the walls they'd raised together. It looked nothing like the original cabin, rough dark, built for necessity. This room held openness, warmth, and something Elias struggled to name but felt deeply each time he stepped inside. Marisol brushed her hands on her apron. "Feels like this room already belongs to us." "It does," he said. "We built it from nothing but timber and stubbornness." "And purpose," she added. He met her eyes, and the truth in her expression tightened something warm in his chest. A faint clatter of hooves drifted from the trail. Elias set down the sanding block. "Rider coming." Marisol's brow lifted. "Jonas, maybe. Or a traveler heading for the pass." They stepped onto the porch just as a horse rounded the last bend. A thin, sunburned preacher guided the reins, his coat dusty from miles of travel. He tipped his hat. "Afternoon," he called, his voice cracked, but friendly. "Mind if I ask for a place to rest my bones and water my horse, huh?" Elias nodded. "You're welcome here." The preacher dismounted with effort. Marisol offered him a tin cup of water before he even asked. He drank gratefully, wiping sweat from his brow. "Merciful heavens," the preacher said, taking in the new room with widened eyes. "You two building an entire kingdom up here?" Elias cleared his throat. "Just making the place fit better." The preacher chuckled. "I seen plenty of men build cabins. Never seen one build a home unless he had someone worth building it for." Marisol's cheeks warmed, though she kept her gaze steady. "We built it together." "You can tell," the preacher said. "Structure's got harmony. Work done side by side always shows it." He asked to sit, and Marisol guided him to the porch bench. Elias fetched water for the horse. When he returned, the preacher was admiring the joinery at the corners of the new room. "Fine craftsmanship," he said. "And she helped with this." "Most of it," Elias answered. The preacher grinned. "Some folks marry for love. Some marry for survival. You two built something sturdier than both." Elias felt Marisol's quiet presence beside him, a warmth without touch, steady but subtle. She didn't smile at the preacher's remark, but her eyes softened with something deeper than acknowledgement. "I believe working well together matters as much as feeling deeply," she said. The preacher nodded approvingly. Spoken like someone who's seen life full circle. They invited him inside for supper. Marisol prepared beans with smoked elk meat, adding herbs Asha had given her months before. The savory aroma filled the cabin, turning it into something that felt even more like a home. The preacher sat at the table and bowed his head in a silent blessing. Elias wasn't a man given to ceremony, but the quiet moment felt fitting. When they began to eat, Marisol asked him about the road south. "Harsh season for travelers," he said. "But I've seen worse. The valley towns are bustling with folks heading west, chasing dreams bigger than their boots." He chuckled softly. "Funny thing is, none of their big dreams looked as steady as what you two have here." Marisol glanced toward Elias. He looked down at his bowl. After the meal, the preacher stepped outside to watch the sunset. Elias followed. The sky burned orange behind the peaks, the kind of glow that hushed the world into reverence. "You've got a companion of rare quality," the preacher said quietly. "I know." "And she sees you," he added. "Truly sees you. That'll change a man." Elias didn't answer. The truth of it pressed against him, not uncomfortably, but with weight. "She's not afraid of the land," Elias said at last. "Or the work. Or the silence." "No," the preacher said. but she's also not afraid of you. Elias exhaled a long breath. That might be the part I still don't know what to do with. The preacher rested a hand on Elias's shoulder. Then learn. The heart is work too. He soon retired to the barn to sleep near his horse. Elias returned inside. Marisol sat near the fire mending a shirt of his torn during the storm weeks before. The warm glow flickered across her face, casting soft shadows along her jawline. "You spoke with him," she said without looking up. "I did." "What did he say?" Elias sank into the chair across from her. "He said you're not afraid of me." Marisol paused, needle poised in midair. "Fear has never built anything worth keeping." "No," Elias said quietly. "It hasn't." Her eyes met his, calm, deep, unreadable but kind. "We are building something, Elias. That requires taking steps neither of us has taken before." He nodded. "I'm trying." "I know." The simple truth of her words undid him more than any speech could have. He watched her finish the last stitch and fold the shirt neatly. When the fire burned low and the preacher's horse snorted softly from the barn, she rose to place the mended shirt into the chest by the bed. "Tomorrow," Marisol said, turning back toward him, "we should start the garden. Our vegetables will take time, and the mountain gives short time in summer." She smiled faintly. "Then we must use it well." They banked the fire and went to their separate sleeping spaces, his bed at the far end, hers near the new room. But neither felt as far apart as before. The air between them carried a quiet understanding, one shaped not by declarations, but by work, by shared days, by the slow turning of seasons. Before he drifted to sleep, Elias heard the gentle sounds of Marisol settling under her blanket. Outside, an owl called from the trees, low and calm. Dawn would come early, and another season of building, this time in earth instead of lumber, waited just beyond the night. "Elias, Mouse," Marisol said, guiding his hand to her belly, "the mountain won't just test us this winter. It will welcome our child." Autumn crept into the valley in slow, deliberate strokes. The first hints of yellow brushed the birch trees, and the morning air carried a cool bite that whispered of winter's approach. Elias rose earlier each day, sensing the shift, the way a man senses an old ache, deep, certain, unignorable. The mountain was preparing itself, and so must they. Marisol stood at the edge of the garden, gathering the last of the late summer squash. Her movements were careful, measured, though he could not yet say why. That caught his attention. She rested more often than she used to. She pressed a hand to her lower back now, and then her brow tightening for the briefest moment before smoothing again. Elias approached, basket in hand. "Frost will take the rest of the plants soon." "I know," she said, but her voice held a softness he hadn't heard before. She shifted the bundle of squash in her arms and handed it to him. "But we gathered enough. The land gave what we needed." He studied her profile, the faint flush on her cheeks, the gentle curve in her lips. She seemed different. Not in any way he could name, only in the way the dawn feels different when a storm is coming or leaving. "You're tired," he said. "Not tired," she answered. "Just full." He frowned. Full, but she only smiled and turned back toward the cabin. He followed, still uneasy without knowing why. Inside, the room filled with the warm scent of herbs as she hung the last bundle Asha had given her months before. Marisol had woven them neatly, tying them with sturdy knots. Each time she touched them, her expression grew thoughtful, as if she felt the land's memory in every dried leaf. As Elias set the basket down, hoofbeats echoed faintly through the valley. Marisol looked toward the open door, a knowing glint in her eyes. That's Jonas, Elias said. Moments later, Jonas Reed rode into view leading a half-loaded mule and waving broadly. His coat was open despite the chill, and his grin stretched wide. "You two ever stop working?" he called out before even dismounting. Marisol greeted him with a cup of cool well water. Jonas gulped it gratefully. "You've got a good harvest," Jonas said, surveying the garden. "Storms'll roll down early this year. Best to get what you can." Marisol nodded. "We finished just in time." Jonas's eyes flicked between the two of them, lingering a second longer on Marisol. Something in her demeanor made him tilt his head. "You holding up all right, Miss Herrera?" "I am well," she replied calmly. "Just adjusting to the season." Jonas didn't pry, but he looked thoughtful as he stepped back outside. Elias helped him unload supplies: grain nails, a bolt of wool fabric, 2 new axe handles. When Jonas was ready to leave, he pulled Elias aside. "She seems different," he murmured. Elias stiffened. "Different how?" "Not in a bad way," Jonas said quickly. "Just softer around the edges, like something's blooming." Elias frowned. "Blooming?" Jonas shrugged. "Asha might know more than I do. She's been watching the weather signs. Might be wise to ask her about the coming winter." Elias nodded, though the unease in his chest deepened. Jonas rode off, leaving the valley quiet again. Later, while Marisol kneaded dough for supper, Elias watched her hands. He had always admired the confidence in her movements, practical, steady, purposeful. But today there was something tender beneath the strength, as though she was aware of holding more than just herself. "Sit," he said gently. "I'll finish the bread." She raised an eyebrow. "You do not like kneading." "I don't need to like it," he replied. "You need to rest." She studied him a moment, then wiped her hands and sat. "You worry too much, and you don't worry enough." Her laughter was soft, warm. "Perhaps between the two of us the balance is right." He kneaded in silence, though his mind was anything but calm. When the bread was rising near the stove, Marisol came behind him and rested her hands lightly on his arm. "Elias," she said, voice low, "there is something I must tell you." His heart stilled. Every instinct braced. She guided his hand gently to her belly. Her touch was firm, certain, steady. The warmth of her skin seeped into his palm. He stared at her, his breath caught halfway. "The mountain won't just test us this winter," she whispered. "It will welcome our child." The world shifted around him quietly, without thunder yet, with undeniable force. All sound faded except the steady rhythm of her breathing. "You're..." "Sure," he murmured. "I am." He swallowed hard, emotions rising too quickly for him to sort. Joy, fear, wonder. A trembling sense of possibility he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. He pulled his hand back only to place both hands on her waist, holding her as though she were something impossibly precious. Marisol. She rested her forehead against his chest. "I didn't want to speak until I felt certain, but now I feel it. Deeply." He wrapped his arms around her, a careful embrace that grew firmer as his breath steadied. "I never thought I know," she said, her voice calm. "Neither did I. But life grows where it chooses, and we have made a place where life can grow." His throat tightened. He had weathered countless storms, hunted through blizzards, stood alone through winters that claimed men stronger than him. But this life inside her felt like facing the mountain's edge and seeing not danger but horizon. He kissed her hair slowly, reverently. When they finally pulled apart, she brushed his cheek with her thumb. "We will need to prepare early," she said. "Winter will come fast." Yes, Elias said, gathering himself. We'll make the home ready. Make everything ready. Her eyes softened with trust. They ate supper quietly, the moment still echoing through the cabin. Elias found himself glancing at her often, as if committing every movement to memory. Marisol noticed, smiling, without teasing. When night settled, he stood on the porch, staring at the moonlit valley. The air felt sharper, brighter, as if the land itself sensed what was growing in the small cabin. Footsteps approached. Marisol joined him, wrapping her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "The stars are clear," she said softly. "Means cold tomorrow," he replied, though his voice held no worry. She leaned beside him against the railing. "Asha said once that storms come in more than one shape. Perhaps blessings do too." Elias took her hand, interlacing their fingers. "That child," he said quietly, "is the strongest blessing I've ever known." She leaned her head on his shoulder, and the mountains stood silent around them, listening, as they always did, holding the weight of new seasons and new life. Ahead, winter waited. But this time, Elias felt something stronger than fear. He felt purpose. As the snow gathered on the window, Elias realized the mountain no longer felt like something to survive. It felt like something that belonged to them. Winter returned the way it always did, quietly at first, with thin fingers of frost creeping along the edges of the creek, then, with a steady tightening of the air that warned of deeper cold on its way. Elias felt the shift each morning. Before stepping outside, sensed it in the brittle snap of twigs. Beneath his boots, smelled it in the sharp clarity of the wind. The land was preparing for the hard season, and so were they. Marisol had grown more careful in her steps as the weeks passed. She still worked beside him, but he watched her closely now. She lifted nothing too heavy. She knelt more slowly. She paused when the cold bit too sharply at her breath. At night, when she thought he slept, she rubbed her lower back with slow circles. Each small change deepened his awareness of her, and of the life growing quietly inside her. He strengthened the door frame, reinforced the roof beams, insulated the new room they'd built with dried moss and wool batting. Every task felt different now, not just preparation, protection. Marisol laughed softly, the first time she caught him hovering. "I am with child," she said, placing a hand over her belly. "Not made of glass." "You're precious either way," Elias muttered, and she kissed his cheek before turning back to her stitching. The first heavy snow arrived in late afternoon. Clouds moved low across the ridge, thick and bruised, and the air fell silent in that particular way that only comes before a true storm. Elias stood on the porch, wind pressing against his coat. Marisol joined him moments later, resting a hand lightly on the railing. "Feels heavy," she said. "It'll be thick by nightfall." She nodded, her breath rising in a soft plume. Snowflakes drifted down slow at first, then faster, until the world blurred. Inside, they set a larger fire and warmed a pot of broth. The new room glowed in a gentle amber, its wide window framing the storm as it deepened. Elias ran a hand over the smoothed wood of the wall. The room felt lived in now, claimed, as though the cabin had expanded to hold everything their lives were becoming. Marisol noticed his touch. "You shaped this place into something strong," she said. "We shaped it," he corrected. She smiled, but fatigue touched her features. He guided her to a chair near the fire. The storm thumped against the roof, but the beams held firm. As night fell, snow rose high outside the window. The wind keened in long, low breaths, but the cabin stood steady, braced for what the mountains would send. Hours passed in warm quiet. Marisol's sewing needle clicked steadily, mending a small blanket she had begun earlier that week. Elias carved a small wooden toy, something he had not carved in years, not since his early attempts at fatherhood had ended in heartbreak. His hands moved slower now, but with greater purpose. The figure took shape, an elk proud and steady. Marisol glanced at his work. For the baby. If you think they'll like it. They will, she said simply. When the wind softened for the first time since sunset, a calm settled over the cabin. Elias stood stretching the stiffness from his shoulders and walked to the window. Snow had climbed halfway up the frame. Beyond that was only white, shifting and endless. He looked back at Marisol. Her face was illuminated by the fire's glow, warm and beautiful. She placed a hand on her belly, with the instinctive tenderness of someone already connected to the life within. Elias crossed the room, knelt beside her, and rested his hand atop hers. Their fingers intertwined. The fire crackled softly, steady as a heartbeat. "You're warm enough?" he asked. "Yes," she whispered. "And safe." He held her hand longer than necessary, then rose to add wood to the stove. She watched him as he worked, a peacefulness in her eyes that made him pause. "You changed," she said softly. He turned. "How so? You stand different. Breathe different. This home, this life has given you something you lost before." He didn't speak for a long time. He felt the truth of her words echo in the deepest parts of him. Solitude had once been his shield, but it had carved hollows inside him too. Hollows he'd stopped noticing because emptiness had become ordinary. Now the hollows were filling. "I didn't think I'd ever build anything like this," he said quietly. "Not again." Marisol pressed a hand against his chest. "You didn't build it alone." Snow thumped heavily against the roof, jolting them both. Elias stepped to the window. The storm was fierce again, swirling thick and relentless. He tested the frame. Solid. The work they'd done through the warm months had held strong. Marisol rose slowly from her chair. "The storm sounds angry." "It's not anger," Elias said. "Just winter taking what winter takes. And giving what it gives," she added, touching her belly again. He nodded, a quiet wonder settling over him. "And giving." They prepared for bed early. Marisol lay beneath the blankets, warm and drowsy, while Elias checked the shutters twice and set extra wood by the stove. When he finally lay beside her, she shifted closer, resting her head against his shoulder. The warmth of her, the certainty of her presence, grounded him. Snow whispered against the window. Wind pulsed softly through the pines. In the calm between gusts, Marisol spoke. "Do you think the child will know this place the way we do?" "Yes," Elias answered without hesitation. "They'll know every ridge, every shift in the wind, every sign the mountain gives." "And what about us?" Her voice was barely audible. "Will they know us well?" Elias turned toward her, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. "They'll know we built this life with intention, with strength, with love even when it wasn't spoken yet." Marisol's breath caught. Her eyes softened in the dim firelight. "Elias." He kissed her forehead gently, a promise forming in the simple touch. "You and this child are my life now. Whatever winter brings, whatever the land demands, I face it, because I have something worth facing it for." Tears glimmered in her gaze, though they did not fall. She pressed her palm against his chest again, feeling the sure beat beneath. "Then we face it together." They lay in the hush of the storm, listening to the world disappear beneath the night's snow. Somewhere outside, a tree branch snapped under the weight, echoing briefly before the wind swallowed the sound. But inside the cabin, held strong, warm, alive, carrying more than just two people. carrying a future. As the fire dimmed, Elias whispered into the quiet, "The mountain no longer feels like something to survive." Marisol shifted her fingers, curling around his. "What does it feel like now?" she asked. He looked toward the window where snow accumulated in soft layers, sealing them inside with warmth instead of fear. "Like something that belongs to us." Marisol closed her eyes, breathing softly against him. "Then let the winter come." It did. And the cabin stood firm through the long, silent hours, holding its warmth, its hope, and the life waiting patiently in the dark for the world to warm again.